Hello everyone and welcome to Handmade Hero, the show where we code a complete game live on stream. I believe, did all the stuff we were gonna do yesterday. One of the bonus of these Krampusloft Blitz streams is you get a lot of programming time and get a lot of stuff done. So we pretty much finished everything up, and I think all the editing actually works now. So the thing that we wanted to move on to was making our UI system not look so ugly. It don't got to win any awards because it's not actually really user facing. It's something only for developers to use, so you can accept a lower standard of visual polish certainly. But we don't want it to be so horrid. Like right now, all we did was sort of the backbone wiry sort of stuff. And we haven't really spent any time making it at all usable. Like it needs to be cleaner looking, and it also needs to be perhaps laid out better and so on. So we've got some stuff we want to do there that's just, a basic sort of coat of paint over the thing. So that's what we'd like to do on this stream. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'll show you in case you've missed, we've done a lot of streams, in case you missed where we are on that. I'll show you where we are on that, and then just briefly explain sort of what I wanted to do to make it a little bit nicer in that regard. So going to the current state of the code, you can see that if I use this here, the UI kind of pops up here. You can see it's totally bare bones, right? It's pretty ugly. And it's just at 0, 0. It's just at the center of the screen, and it just draws it, right? And so that's not what we want, right? We want something that's going to be maybe over here on the side or something, like, you know what I mean? Like we'd like it to be, if I made it full screen and we actually imagined us adjusting some things, we'd want it to occupy probably over here. We'd want this line to be more legible and a little bit easier to use there. We'd want these buttons to be laid out a little more sensibly. I would like it to be harder, for example, to hit the save button. I mentioned that before. A little harder to hit the revert button. So these are more serious operations. They're things that you don't want to hit by accident. Undo, redo is probably fine, but again, I don't want the size of the buttons to change like that, right? So we've never done any UI like work here that really tries to make this stuff feel right. And so that's really what I want to do, is sort of try to improve the quality of this. And so that's what I'm going to focus on today. If I have time, I'd also like to fix the positioning of these things to be based on sort of screen agnostic coordinates, percentage-based coordinates, or something similar to that. Because I don't like having to move these around every time like that. I want them to, and that has nothing to do with the UI we were working on. It's just a thing that would be nice to have in there. So let's get started on that. So we're just doing sort of the visual cleanup here and adding code to be a little bit more sensible about how those sorts of things should work themselves out. What I want to do is start by inside the editor here. I want to kind of make some way of positioning this thing more sensibly, like I said. So what I think wants to happen here, and I could be wrong about that, but just reading the sort of limited writing that's on the wall in this case, we sort of have this notion of sections here. You can sort of see this begin section idea. And I think what I want to do there is I want to have that begin section call. Probably I would like that to be a sort of a tabbed kind of a thing almost. Like I think I want to do something probably like this, where we don't really go through sections. I'm trying to think of how we want to do that. Maybe we want to do it like that. Not sure. Well, yeah, yeah, I don't know. Not sure whether I want that inside or out, but something like this where we can kind of have, this window, it would list what section it was on the top, and maybe if we added more sections, you could pick which one you were looking at any given time, right? Because again, I don't want this user interface to take up much space on the screen. So I would like to be able to, if we ever added another type of edit in here that wasn't alignment points, that was something else, you know, I would want to maybe have some way of, to pick between those without having to have like fussy debug keys. Like I don't want to have to remember like, oh, it's F7 to edit alignment points and F9 to do this, and you know, that kind of thing. So, you know, we'll cross those bridges when we come to them more, but I do kind of want to make it so that it looks a little bit more like that. And then I want that to kind of be wrapped up more in a window and understand where it's going to be better than 0, 0, obviously, right? So that's kind of what we're looking for here. Okay, so looking at this, the code that actually does begin section, at the moment, I'm just going to say it's always returns true, just because that's, you know, maybe I'll write it this way instead. Because it doesn't really have anything else to do, but we'll, you know, go ahead and make that happen. Inside the code that actually calls the renderer, so when I'm actually, you know, using the editor, when I go to actually draw, this begin layout call, this is most of the problem here in terms of how things are aligning themselves. What I'd like to do with that, at least for a start, is just say, well, you know, I know that this thing is inside a certain rectangle's worth of stuff, right? I mean, I have some idea, you know, roughly about how big maybe that is. So if we look at the dev UI here, you know, we've got this default clip rect, for example. And that default clip rect is going to tell me the board, you know, the entirety of the screen, I believe. I could be wrong about that because I don't really remember how we chose to specify clip rect coordinates. So I don't remember exactly what those amount to. So what I'm going to do at first is I'm just going to go ahead and, well, you know what, let's just live dangerously. I'm going to go ahead and try just saying like default clip rect min x right now, and just to see what that does, right? I don't know what it will do. I also don't remember. Yeah. So I just want that to see if that would peg me to the left side of the screen. We should look at how that's created, though, to see if that's actually going to be the case. But anyway. All right, so it looks like that clip rect is maybe in pixels, potentially. I'm not sure. So, because that's still giving us a value of 0, which would not be what I would expect, right? So what we need to do here is we need to have some kind of way of figuring out what we could pass down here that would actually give us the leftmost border of the screen. And in order to do that, I think we may need to save, right? Because it doesn't look like we're saving that information anywhere. Maybe it's in the render group. I'll take a look. But we need some way of saying like what that pixel position would actually be. Let me take a look here. So inside the render group, we've got, I mean, we could always reverse engineer it from the game transform, certainly. But again, not really what I would want to do. So I think, you know, again, it just might make more sense to say, let's save that data inside the dev UI for people who want to use it, right? So looking through here, what I would want to do inside the dev UI is I'd want to be able to put some information in here about where those screen corners are. And probably the easiest thing to do would just be like to put a rectangle in here that are the screen dimensions, right? Like screen space, right? And inside here, we'll just specify what those are going to be. So when we create that projection, this will be something that lets us position the way we want. So then, you know, we can't use the clip rec because that's in actual pixel space or whatever. We can use this as our, you know, our role space. I mean, it's really like UI space, I guess. Might be the way to say it. So when I actually go and make one of these dev UIs, what I want to do is I want to save that information at that time because we know what it is because we're setting up the transform. You can see that right here. And so we need to go ahead and create something that's going to have those balanced coordinates there. And we need to, you know, do some reverse engineering to figure out what those screen coordinates actually map to. You know what I mean? So what I want to do here is I want to set my UI space up so that I can set them in and set the max. I can do that in a couple different ways. I could probably, you know, maybe the best way to do it is something like this, where we do a center dim. Because we know that the center is 0, 0, right? And we know that the width is width. So what we want to do at that point is just say, well, we don't know what the height is, but we do know what the screen height, we do know like how big the screen was when we said what the window height was. And so if you're actually doing a transform that's even the whole way through, then you should end up with exactly the right coordinates for this to be, you know, height. Not sure what the, is it 2v2s or is it for reals? Yeah. So my assumption would be that this, if this is at the center and that's the total dimensions, this should just give us back the right UI space. You know, famous last words. But, you know, so that way it'll always be pegged to the center line and then, you know, this sort of region of the screen. You know what I mean? So, yeah, like that seems fine to me. That would be easy enough to edit. So, you know, I can pick things over here and then in here I can, you know, do whatever I want to do. Seems fine. So that's all well and good. I now want to do some, maybe a little bit of like backgrounding here. I'd like to sort of make a backdrop for this thing and maybe put the title on there. So, you know, like that begin section thing. Maybe that sort of allows me to draw what this stuff has here. And maybe that section, I'm just, you know, sort of imagining in my head, maybe that section piece is also like where I could hide the save and revert. So I'm just thinking out loud here, you know, if I have multiple sections, maybe the undo, redo, and the save, revert stuff, you know, maybe those things can be done that way, and that would help put those in a different location. You know, I don't know. Now, one of the interesting things about undo, redo, right, is that you kind of want those available everywhere. So, you know, if I was looking at this, maybe what I would say is, you know, maybe it looks a little bit more like that. And maybe we've got something more like this going on. You know what I'm saying? So something where you have to actually manually switch to like another section of the user interface to hit one of those other options might be better. I don't know. That's just my thinking on it. I don't have a strong opinion, but you know, something like this. And so that way, you know, maybe the undo and redo are always there. They're in a row by themselves. And then, you know, there's like a section that encloses these things. And there's a section that encloses the attach points. And you're alignment points rather, and you're only ever seeing one of those at a time. So you can't really hit revert by accident from trying to do undo redo or something. Save and revert being close to each other, I don't know much about how to fix that. I mean, the poor man's solution would be like this, I suppose. I don't know. So let me go ahead and put some tab stuff in there basically so that we can separate those two things out. And, you know, that way, you know, save and revert would be pretty distant from each other. I don't know if that's a good idea or a bad idea, but that's just something to think about. So I'm going to go ahead and try making two tabs there. The begin section, end section stuff, so the IDs, I'm going to want that same process that we were doing before, where we have these like IDs that tell you what's happening here. So we're going to want, you know, the dev ID from pointer stuff. We're going to want that. And I think, you know, in that case, this should be fine. So making the section that way, I think, would be reasonable, because now it would have a thing that lets you, you know, you can use that to uniquely identify what section you're talking about. And the same thing would be true here. So we'd have like, you know, section name equals align points, and here we'd just do dev ID from pointer, section name, right? And so now we've got this notion that the sections can actually be selected. And so what I want to do is go over to the UI and say, all right, let's, inside the dev UI, let's have some understanding of which sections are active and which sections aren't. Now, there's an additional, I guess there's sort of an additional issue here that when you do begin section, you're going to have to provide, and that is, what is the mutual exclusion set for the sections? And I think that part is not that hard to do. The part that's a little harder is just figuring out how you want that picking to go. So I don't really have a particularly solid idea of how I would do that. Like, what I want probably is this. I would probably say, here's a section picker, right? And the section picker would like itself be a thing. So in the editor, you would say, I've got this section picker that stores which section is active. So I can set it at any time too, like just to whatever I want it to be. So there'd be like dev UI section picker. Something like that. And this would just be, you know, something like that. And so when you came through here, you'd say, well, you know, I want you to let the user pick from some set of sections, and I want them to do it right here. And that's probably right, like its own row. But, you know, it might not even want to be its own row. You know, maybe it wants to be something else, right? Like maybe it wants to be at the end of this row. So you got undo and redo, and then you've got a picker for which section you're in. You know, I don't know. and so who knows what happens there, but you do something like this. And then when you come down to like saying that we're going to have sections, those sections would just be based on, they would just occur based on whether or not they were selected from this. So you would probably say like, every time you did that, you would just say, here's the section picker that controls whether I'm active or not. You know what I mean? And go from there. That's about all I can think of. Seem reasonable? Now, it's a little bit squinky because you need some way of remembering what all of the options actually were. So that's a little bit harder. And I mean, the most straightforward way would just be every time we encounter a section, we link those sections up with the main section that's stored there, and then it knows what all the ones are to pick from. But that's a little more stateful than possibly I would like because, I don't really want to have to do a lot of heavyweight work there for no reason. So I'm trying to think if there's a simpler way to do it. If you actually had each of these sections wrapped in like a deterministic way, you could do some more clever stuff, but I don't see that being really that good. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to be perhaps a little bit too clever here, and I'm going to try something I have not tried before when doing UI stuff. It's really kind of ridiculous, but I'm going to see if it works because it's just interesting, and I like just exploring new ideas. So let's suppose I introduce a notion here called the Dev UI picker, just like we said before, right? And the only thing it stores is the current section ID. So what it says is if I am, if the users interact with this section, then what you get is it remembers what section is currently looked at. So it makes the begin section called trivial to implement because we just look at what was the dev ID you're given and what was the current one. And if they're equal, you process the section. If they're not equal, you don't process the section, right? So that's a pretty straightforward way to implement that operation. Then what we need is a forwards and backwards, right? We need some way of you being able to select through the different sections, for example, or to pick from a list, this, that, and the other thing. And so if we want something that does that, what we would need to do is be able to say, well, the user starts interacting and they want to go to like the next section or something. We don't know what that is. But we would know what that was if we just introduced one more variable here, probably. Going to the next one is actually pretty easy. Going to the previous one is slightly harder, but again, only requires one other variable. So I think it's just this. I know it looks weird that you can implement the whole thing with just those two, but I think you might be able to. Let's take a look at that. So at the outset, when we do begin section, we need to take whatever the picker was, right? Oops. And we need to take whatever our ID is. So obviously, the result now is trivial. It's just going to take a look to see whether or not the picker's current section ID and the section ID that you're trying to operate on now are the same. If they are, we're done. Now we just need the logic for going forwards and backwards in sections. And I think all we have to do that is say, look, if the picker's current section is invalid, then it's just, I will just assume it's me. So in an uninitialized scenario, we just become whatever the first section is in the list. So if no one initializes us, that's fine. We just pick the first section. Done, right? If the picker's current section ID equals the picker's prev section ID. Oh, I forgot. So I did forget the variable that I said we needed, which was if we are trying to move one forwards, right? So if we're trying to we need the control variable that says what operation we're trying to do if we want to go forwards or backwards, right? So something like this. So then we can actually do something where we said, all right, here's what we're going to do. We could do something like this. So we have like the various things that you could do. So by default on startup, it's going to be this. So we could just say, hey, if picker move equals that, well, you know what, I'm going to have one for each of those. So let's just do a switch. So if it's an init, then I just set it. If it's a keep, I don't need to do anything. If it's a prev, I'm trying to go to the previous one. And if it's a next, I'm trying to go to the next one. Right? So if I'm trying to go to the previous one, then all I have to do is say, well, if I'm the current one. Oh, and by the way, anytime we do one of these, we're done. So if I'm trying to initialize, then I just initialize, right? And then I'm done. If I'm trying to go to the previous one, then what I want to do is say, well, you know, if the current section ID equals my section ID, then I know that whatever the previous section ID was is actually the one that should be the current section ID, right? So whoever came in last is the one I want to move to. And similarly, if in this case I want to go to the next one, then if the current section ID, if the prev section ID equals the current section ID, I should have written this way after all, current section ID, then I know that the previous person was the current section. So I need to make the current section be me because I'm the one who comes after them, right? So I'm pretty sure that's the entire implementation. Pretty simple. Requires 2 extra variables. One is the previous one, and one is what you were trying to do. I don't know what I think of that, but that's where we're at. We could, if we want to make this even more ridiculous, I think, we may, just looking at it, I'm thinking we may not even really need that. So if you look at what these are actually doing here, we could have probably made those just be interactions. I don't know that I really want to do that, but you could have done that. And then this wouldn't be necessary. You'd just look at this, you just look at the interaction in question and you would use that. So yeah, pretty simple actually, I think, surprisingly enough. If you actually just think it through, it's actually very, very basic. So I do need this concept of a section picker, though. That's like a separate kind of a thing that we've got. But really, it's sort of in a way not. It's really like entirely implementable in almost the exact same way as this code was, you know. So we certainly can here just do what was the thing called again? It's a dev UI section picker. We can just implement it basically the same way, and the difference here would be instead of doing the ink or deck, and instead of ever, we don't consider these being edits or anything. So what we would do here in these cases is we would just say, well, when we go forwards and backwards for this thing, we want to set inside the picker what the move is that the picker was going to do. So in this case, it's a prev move, and in this case, it's a next move, and off you go. Now, in this setup, we need to be able to get the name that we want to print. And I think we probably just want that to be in here. That's separate from the implementation of how you pick stuff, but we probably just want like current name in there, right? And so that's pretty simple. It just means that anytime you call begin section, we just need you to pass that name in here. And you know what, I guess and basically anytime you assign something in here, you would want to set the name. So anytime the picker current section ID, I guess anytime result is true, then you want the current name of the picker to be equal to the name that's given here, right? And you know what, I do. I just want to do that. I don't really like char stars, so now that we have a string there, I'm just going to use it. You know, I would rather have it that way. So in here, yeah, this doesn't actually need a label text there. And we'll play around with this a little bit more. But there we go. And I don't know that there's really much else left to do here. We just need to be able to create a wrapped version of that. I don't remember what we called that function. I guess we called it wrapz. So going ahead and looking at what we've got now, well, that was anticlimactic. So what I'd like to do is go in and debug that, see why we can't get our left and rights going there. Like when I click on that, I wanted it to execute the move there. And so, you know, looking at this here, when we do pick or move next, oops. I feel like that should have worked. The question is, why didn't it? So the initialization part worked correctly because this got set, so that's good. When we get a pick or move prev, we're looking to see whether the current section ID equals our section ID. And so that's basically saying if this result would be true. And if it turns out that it is true, then we move to the previous one, right? Which is whatever the last person through this path would have called. And we said to keep. That feels like that should have worked, so I'm not sure why it didn't. I don't know. Oh, because there is no other section. I didn't select anything. Yeah, all right. So it did work just fine. So that's good. And now we can kind of like keep ourselves from accidentally hitting anything there that might be untoward, which is kind of a good thing, right? And it allows us to, you know, make sure that, you know, we can hit undo and redo anytime we want, but we don't have to worry too much about accidentally hitting save. And then if I want to, I can always go back to the HHA and hit save or revert, right? So that all looks good. And so now I think we're just down to the original thing I was saying about just straight up beautification. So trying to clean all this up to look nicer and be aligned and all that stuff, right? So just basic typography and clean, like, you know, not really serious graphic design of any kind, but, you know, trying to be less disgusting. So, well, you know, I don't really know exactly what I want to do there, but I mean, the first thing I think I would do is inside the layout. A lot of these things, when you look at how they're being drawn, you know, we're passing in a thickness for the border. So there's like a thickness for the border of those, right? And, you know, same here. I think I might want that to be somewhat parametric. So like inside the layout, I think maybe here we would actually specify, in addition to these things, like, you know, like the border or thickness. So there's, I don't really know what to call that, but just like the box thickness, right? And so in here we would just say, well, whatever the layout's thickness is, that's what we're going to use. And so when we do like things like these, they all get that same thickness in basic text element. And so all of this stuff, including these buttons, I want to sort of follow that thickness rule. So, you know, this calls action button here, and an action button, I really just want I want these to follow the thicknesses too. So like action button and boolean button, those both want that that as well. I don't really remember to what extent those are used by the debug system, but again, I don't care because the debug system can set its default thickness here to be different as well. So when we call a basic text element here, again, I'm gonna say that like label should get that thickness too, so that all of that stuff is more systemic, right? So that, you know, that can all be kind of handled a little bit. So when you create one of these dev layouts, I'm going to set it to 6 by default. You know, when you start a layout, and that'll just be something that would do in terms of giving things a little bit more of a border there. So that should happen on these two now. Like those should be a little thicker than they were, hopefully, presumably. You know, I don't really know. So that's fine. And then let me go ahead and look at if that makes this stuff look a little bit better. So you can kind of see now that that's a little bit more readable. It's not great yet, you know, it's not perfect, but it's better than it was, which is sort of what we're looking for here. Because at least now these things are aligned and so on. So the next step there is I want to be able to do a little bit more so I think one of the problems I'm having is like switching between button and label is bad because I want buttons you can't push to still look like buttons, so that you know that they would be buttons in the case where you like undo and redo. I want them to always look like buttons. I just want them to have like a more grayed out, like you can't click this look, but so that it still looks like a button. So I would like to do that. I also want, again, like a backdrop in here. So I want this to be like a solid window. So that you can't, like, I accidentally click off this all the time, right? And I don't want that. Like, if I misclick here, I don't want that to actually, for it to think that I'm actually clicking like to pick like that. So I want to change that as well. So that seems pretty good. Two parent prep, like the way we do boolean buttons, I can probably improve as well. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff to do here. So I'm not sure where to start. Let me start by so that's an interesting case, by the way. So there is one bug I just saw with the way I was handling this. So if you are on alignment points and then you click off, you can't move to previous or next. And the reason for that is because you never see this section. So I guess you do need one more thing, which is that inside the picker, you need a thing that's like, you need some way of saying if we never saw like if we never see the section that we're supposed to be looking for, like if the current section goes away, we need to reset to a different section. You know what I mean? And that's actually harder. So I guess the way I would do that is this way. It's a little weird, but if you think about it, when you call section picker, you have the ability here to just say, well, when I'm doing one of these section pick operations, I know that I could set current section exists to false, in which case, when I go through all the rest, it should get set to true by someone else eventually. Like so. And it's a little bit squinky, but like, yeah, basically anytime anyone is able to set the current thing. So if I moved to the previous one here, right, like I would need to set it there as well. As long as someone sees that, then when we do section picker, we can say that the next time around, we can just look to see, you know, if picker current section exists. What we can do here is just clear that out. Oops. And if I zero that out, then that means that when you have that section get deleted, it will automatically clear it, right? So that way, you know, I've got the HHA. I can't switch because that's the only section at the moment. If I switch here, you know, I can go through those all I want. And then the other thing I can do is now, if I click off of it, I should still be able to, well, that should have done it. So I guess it didn't do that. Why didn't it do that? Oh, because I set the wrong thing. That's what I meant to do. So I think that solves that problem. It's a very weird way to implement a section picker. I don't mind telling you, but sometimes I like to try weird stuff. So there you go. So now it reverts back, right? Okay. So again, button, I wanted to be able to have an enabled disabled on button. And so what it's doing right now is it does the enabled disabled thing. Action button, I don't know who calls action button exactly. But I kind of don't know that I really want it to be calling that anymore. So I think that's not going to get called. So I think what I'm going to do instead is here I'm going to call basic text element with the interaction, and with the interactions here, I think what I might do is say you know, if you were going to execute that, execute it, and the enabled will set what I want the background color to be, and probably also what this color would be. So it's really going to be more like this. And then these colors are going to be set accordingly. So, you know, if you have a disabled button, it's, oops, I don't know why I started editing the wrong case. If you have a disabled button, then it's going to be like not highlightable, and I guess I can keep that at the bottom. It's not going to be highlightable, and the background color maybe also will dim down somewhat from where it is, so it'll be like, you know, kind of more obvious. Or you know what? No. Maybe it's just gray, right? Like it's just a gray thing to indicate that you can't really click on it, you know? And that way the enabled part just kind of works, and it won't change the button-y-ness of it. Right, so you can see now very clearly the difference between buttons when they are available and unavailable there. What happened there? That looked buggy. That was weird. So it's like the enabled was not quite set right or something. What's going on? We gotta take a look at that. But either or. So let's suppose I just leave this as it is. And make maybe this look like this. Again, I'm just kind of guessing here about what would be good. Yeah, that's a little bit better. So like, you can see that the undo button was supposed to light up, but it didn't. And then when I click on that, it still allows me to click for some reason, which I don't want it to do. So I don't know if, I think that's because the interaction has to be set to something else so it doesn't actually occur. So maybe I do want to do it this way. And just say, look, if it's not enabled, then the interaction type equals DevUI interaction none or something. Oops. So that still lets me click on an invalid on an invalid one, and I don't understand why. Right? Like I don't understand why that's letting me do that. That's peculiar, because if the interaction is none here, then I shouldn't be able to interact with any time I render the thing gray. You shouldn't be able to click on it because I'm saying specifically that I don't want there to be any way to interact with it, right? So it shouldn't allow you to click because there shouldn't be a type unless we currently just have it so that that type of interaction actually works, which would be weird, but maybe that is how we wrote it accidentally. So like, yeah, in this case, I think what we want to say is this interaction, I guess that is true. Like it does actually create an interaction for a none. But on the other hand, it should never it should never have set next to execute though, right? So I'm still a little confused. Like, I don't really see why that would be happening, because if you set it to none, it's not immediate button, so it shouldn't actually do either of those two things. Like the next to execute part. Ooh. What did I knock over? Oh, I knocked over the poor little owl. There we go. So that's strange. I don't quite get that, and I may have to debug that to find out exactly what's going on there, because I'm not sure I don't follow the logic about why something that's set to dev UI interaction none, while that can become the active interaction, it should not like produce results, because the executing one here, you know, that result value would never come back true. So I really don't know what that's about. I mean, obviously I can fix it here by not actually filling this part in, you know. And that should prevent it, because now it can't identify this one. And we'll see if that does do it or not, because now I'm not sure, right? Because I don't follow the logic. Nope. All right, so clearly I just don't understand what's going on here, right? And so we should go ahead and compile in debug mode, figure out how it is that we're able to actually click on a button that itself is not, you know, should not ever be available. Let's go ahead and take a look at why that's happening. Because I'm stumped. So I'm going to set to debug mode. We're going to run. And here we are in edit land. I'm going to go to the point alignment points. If I click on this, the undo button is not highlighted. So the first thing I want to do is just find out why. So if I go to Handmade in-game editor and I look at undo and redo, right, what I'm expecting to see here is undo available should be returning true, right? And it's not. So what's the problem? If I look at the undo sentinel, it is true that there's nothing on it. If I look at the in progress sentinel, there's nothing on that either. And so it looks like that edit got like swallowed up or something. So first thing we got to do is debug where that went. Let me see here. So where is that? So basically here, inside this edit align point call. So in here where we go in here and say match, you know, we request this match. We say get or create edit in progress, right? And it goes and it gets, it looks for one that matches the one we asked for, and you know, if it can't find it, it gets it back, puts it on the in progress lane, and then later on, when we're actually doing stuff here, if the interaction is over, we do a push first here. So, maybe the first thing to ask for is like, what's going on there, right? Like, why is that failing? And it looks like, it's getting called. Let's see what happens in the situation where we are going to do that edit we're literally talking about. So I go here and I click on this. So that end interaction never got into here. So the interaction isn't actually ending when the mouse goes up. It's like this isn't happening or something. Right? So we must have this wrong. Like we must have got that. We must have got this wrong. So let me verify that's the case. Here we are in edit mode. I click. I switch. We got there that time. So now I'm going to click on this. And we got there this time as well. Oh, wow. Okay, no. I get it. I get it. So, because this is one frame behind, meaning we will set the thing to execute and then it has to go and execute it, it won't have happened yet by the time you get here. And that's pretty tricky, right? So, you will call this one edit late always. Oof, that's crazy. So what you want to do in this case is you want to say on execute, like when I actually executed the thing, then I move it. And that's kind of crazy. I don't love that. So if we wanted to handle that the most straightforward way, we still can. It's just not fabulous. But when this happens, you do know that it happened, right? Because you're going to clear that, like, inside Dev UI, right? We've got the thing here where we're like next to execute and it clears that, right? So after you've done the execute operation, you can then, you know whether you needed to do that update. It's a little crazy. So, in here, you would actually do this. You wouldn't be doing it this way. And really the end interaction part here is really not doing anything. So all you would add is when you call the, when you get to the end of this, right? When this is done, you would say, if you would run and execute, right? So you, and maybe the better way to put that would be here. So if you've run and execute and then you're done with it, then it's a time that you could do this, right? So when you come through here, you're going to do a bunch of things that you may need to do where you're going to like set what you would execute or you know, who knows what. Um, And yeah, I don't really love that. So the alternative to that is to change the way we're doing the execution a bit. Instead of having an execute, we would actually just put that as something that directly does the edit, which is just, it's harder on the rest of the code because you got to actually then have a switch statement there that's like which kind of edit was happening here and so on, right? And then the other way is kind of nasty. It's basically a thing that says, hey, when you are done with a particular execution pass here, then you need to do this operation. And it's not the end of the world if you want to do that. It looks kind of like, it would look kind of like this. Inside here, we do update and render editor. At the end of it, we would look and say, if the, we would do a couple things. First, after we do that pass, this would move out into here. So this, the place where this actually happens would be here. So it would be that the editor has the notion of what's being executed, you know. So that we would handle in here, and we might actually not have to do the next and two. That might not have to happen anymore because we're handling it in this loop. So then here what we would say is, well, if there was a to execute and now there isn't, then we would do this. So basically here, if we're going from a state of executing something to not executing something, then we're done, and we should save all of the edits that we made, right? I mean, it's not fabulous, you know. It's not my favorite thing I've ever done in the world, but it would work. All right, so let's just say we did that, as dumb as it sounds. So the way that would work is inside the in-game editor, it would now be the thing that controls what execution is occurring, right? And so in here, when we would be setting the UI stuff, we wouldn't actually be setting the UI stuff. We'd be setting the editor stuff. And that's all fine. That execution that occurs here, we then still need the UI system just to know what is being executed. So if we look through here for the places where that's happening, we would just change it so that that's part of the layout. And so when you begin one of these layouts, you would just pass it what you wanted to execute there. And so when the editor goes to actually draw its stuff and you make one of these layouts, we would say, oh, you know, the thing you're going to execute is the thing that we tell you to execute. Like I said, not fabulous, but that's just how that goes. And that is dev UI interaction. Okay, so this is probably one of these. Or do we not have one of those? No, we did. Yeah, so that's ugly. But UI code often is, so There's that. Let's take a look here. So I can still click on things that aren't actually available there, it looks like. Maybe that's not what's happening. Maybe that's just because I'm clicking into empty space. So we'll see. But now that's looking a little better. So let me go ahead and play with that a little bit more. So I think that may just be, yeah, so that's not actually clickable. I was wrong about that. It's just that we don't protect you from clicking off of the selection. So I think we're more reasonable now. Right? I think we're in good shape here. Okay. So I think that's all good. What I'd like to do now is try to clean up that hit apron. So this is probably what needs to happen. So, instead of none in the case of something that isn't clickable, it would actually be a NOP, I think is what we need there, so that it knows that it's not nothing. It is something that you could have interacted with, but in this particular case, it's the interaction is to not do anything and to prevent you from doing anything as well, right? So that you don't accidentally click off of it. And so, so there we go. So that's much better, right? So I think that's good. And now I just want to make sure there's an apron that does that exact thing. So that there's basically like one blanket element that would be the primary element there. Now, I think all I have to do in that case is just make like a rectangular element that if the mouse is inside it, it's just a none interactor. So like if we look at basic text element, you can kind of see how that's going here. And this is the code we would use for that, I think, right? So I can say in the in-game editor, where's that layout? So in here, maybe I want to have a thing that lets me say, this layout is actually a box, And so what I would do there is pass a rectangle like something that looks like this. So inside begin layout, you know, which normally does that, you could have another version here that's a utility function that if you say there's a rectangle. Now, you know, looking at this, you want to rect min max has to actually obey rect min max. So technically it would be this. Right? And so this is the box in question. And when we do this layout, we would call the normal layout function as well. Oops. Maybe I'll do it like that. And the upper left corner would just be whatever the box's min x was and whatever the box's max y was. And that should do exactly the same thing, but now we're passing in the size. So now when we run this, we should get the same result, but we can now include a apron there that would prevent it from anyone from clicking in that region. So yeah, so you know, we go in here and like that. And I don't know how big we want that to be, but you know, we can sort of look at that a little bit more later, I guess. I don't know. We'll have to see. Oops. That's kind of weird. Well, anyway, we'll deal with that later. So if I want to draw that box in there, then all I'm going to do is, again, take a look at one of those, like, you know, begin text element. I'm sorry, basic text element. And the basic text element call is just doing one of these element rectangle operations. So if I want to capture one of those in here, I should be able to do something like this. Now, when this thing does one of these, and I guess I got to move this down to a place where it can actually call some of this stuff, right? We don't want to have to pass a dimension and have it actually like update the size of things, though, is the only thing. Like, we don't really want it to do a lot of this stuff. Because this is like trying to place stuff. It's trying to put things into locations and all these other sorts of things. Why there are so many push recs here, I have no idea. It's like drawing a black... What is that for? Does anyone know what this is supposed to do? Like, what is that code? Oh, that's for if it's sizable. I see. So that's if you want to be able to size it. What? So it draws a border around the element. Okay, all right, okay, sure. I'll give you that. So again, just looking at all this stuff, I don't think, you know, in this case, we would just do this stuff directly. So if we call begin layout box, we're going to automatically set our UI's next hot interaction type to be there we go. If the mouse is inside the rectangle that we have, we're going to automatically say that the next interactions type is going to be no op, because we don't want anything to happen unless you're actually over a UI element. We want to block any click through. So we need to like get the element bounds now, and so figuring out what the element bounds are, you can see here it does this calculation, which is doing all kinds of nuts to move it around. We already have that stuff, I think. So I believe it's literally just the box, right? And then we would like to draw that area, so we would like to do a push rect. So in here where we're doing this sort of thing, we want to be able to drop that back behind the whole thing. So would be this, and I guess this doesn't need to happen here. So it's really just that's the entirety of the code, I think. And this probably should be a parameter that you can set in case you want different colors there. I'm going to say it's just a translucent, like, you know, dark backdrop, and that's all there is. Let's see what happens here. So there we go. It's really interesting what happens in this mode. It's like the scaling is off. I don't know what's going on there. It's a good question. So looking at this, I would like the area here to be a little bit more compressed. We'll take a look at that in a second. But otherwise, I think we're good. So I would like to, couple things. First of all, this should probably be a little bit darker. 0.5 was not doing it for me there. And I would like the upper corner here to have maybe the thickness respected, sort of in a duplicate sense, maybe. So I'd sort of like something to happen in here. I'm not sure what the value should be. Maybe it shouldn't be the thickness, maybe it should, but I'm just gonna have a border inset there probably, just to make things a little bit easier to see. Oops. All right. So it's seems good. You can notice I can't click on anything in here, which is the goal. So that seems pretty good. What I will say is it would be nice maybe if this was a little smaller. So we might want to try and condense how this is being drawn so it doesn't take up so much space. Changing the size and percent Ps would be probably a good start. So, you know, something like that. And then this could be knocked over a bit, right? So instead of 0, 0, it could be like whatever the min-x is, you know, could be more like that. So I think all that's good. I might put the delete here. The parent stuff, I may just make that a toggle. This doesn't really even need to be there, so I think that label can go away. So I'm going to put that here. I'm going to take that out of here entirely. And this, for editable booleans, I'm going to change the way those work. What I probably want to do there inside the dev UI is I'd like the editable boolean to not do this. I think I just want it to be a button that has different colors depending on the circumstance, you know? So it's maybe something more like this. I mean, it would be nice to use the button code. So I wonder if maybe I could just have those be parameters to it, default parameters to it that you could specify, actually, because it would be nice if you could just do this. Right? It's a lot simpler if that's the case. So if I was to call through to this one and, you know, I just wanted a different highlight or something, I don't know. I don't have a good idea for this one. I mean, I guess one thing we could do here is say, you know, take what was going on and just merge them together into a single button piece of text. So that the way that this is working, it's just like, and I guess we could even have that be based on the value. You know, the person could pass those in as the values too. I don't know. I'm not thinking of anything here. Sorry. Yeah. Where'd the rest of the stuff go, though? What did I do? How come none of these came through there? So, was it just because I got rid of that string? Like, what happened to editable type? Let's try that. All right. All right, so that's reasonable. And I might make the color of that change too. I don't know. So inside here, it would be nice if it stayed the same size. So that's a little bit annoying, but you know, because I don't like the fact that it shifts. In here, when we call button, I may say, look, you can set the backdrop color if you want to, and that'll let you set this here. And for this one here, it'll just, if you're disabled, it'll always go to gray for the moment anyway. So then when we do an editable boolean, you can set the backdrop color based on the value. So like at the end of this, we can say, well, you know, it can be this or this. So maybe we'll do like, okay, you know, it's green if you have it set, and it's red if you haven't, or something. So you kind of know like green means go, red means stop, or something. In both cases, I want it to be full alpha, don't want it to be see-through. I don't know why I keep closing the app too. I should probably just leave the app running. It does seem like maybe they're a little too dark there too, like the text I just mean. So yeah, it seems like maybe this should be more like a 7.5. I do think because our live code reloading does have that string rebasing problem that's kind of annoying. I wonder if we should like just not do that anymore. So when we unload the game code here, because it's just annoying to have to constantly deal with that. So if we just never unload the library, then we wouldn't have that problem. And then we don't have to worry about it as much, right? All right, so it's a little bit hard to read against that backdrop still, I think. So I kind of want to make maybe the backdrop be a little bit dimmer. So I'm just kind of looking at the Dev UI code here. So like the default maybe on this, should just be a little darker. So maybe it's, more like that, just not so bright. You know what I mean? Did that actually do it? That doesn't actually seem to be looking. So that doesn't really seem to be doing the reload. What did I do wrong there? Is there a reason why we cannot get code reloading anymore? Because not freeing the library should still be fine, right? Like it should be able to still do its reload like it normally would. Like it can still go through here and reload the file, yeah? Oh, no, it can't. Interesting. So if we want to be fancier there, we actually have to move it to different temp names every time. That's interesting. So here, where we do this temp game code DLL full path, we would actually have to have a way of cycling those. Yeah, so that's definitely trickier. And so I think what we'd want to do there is keep trying to move it to a new file name until we couldn't anymore. But I think that's worth doing, right? So if you look at how this works here, we would need some way of like adding to that, like making that file name be able to sort of increment and go forward, so it can, you know, go up by one or pick a random number that it sticks on the end of that, right? Because we want to be able to say, look, if the current DLL is still in use, that's okay. We'll just keep on using it and copy the newly built DLL to a new location and run that, right? So if you look at how this is going, the cat strings part of things here, right? We need to be able to stick a number at the end of that or something. It's just some monotonically increasing thing. And this, I don't know if this has the ability to call shares. Does it? Let's find out. Yeah, it does. So we could convert this to using format string now, and that would make this a lot more powerful. So we could just have an incrementing number there, and we wouldn't need to use cat strings anymore, for example, right? So in here, where we're calling this, we would just say, you know, where we've got these source and stuff, and we would get the to-do desc bounds checking would be done as well, because format strings does that. So if we were to say, look, we want a format string that's like this and that, and we are then saying that the things that we're passing are these, that's actually pretty easy to do. In fact, yeah, so like if we just get rid of this entirely, and then we call format string, and we say, here's the desk count, here's the dest. We've got two things we want you to concat on. They're A and B. And so here's all we need you to do with that. So the file name part, that's just a rapz. This other part here, is not a rapz. That's actually something where we want to, you know, do whatever this nonsense is. Right? Something like this. So then that can concatenate those together for us. And what that means is we should be able to, what's the question here? Oh, for crying out loud. So that should work just fine, I would think. And now we have the ability to optionally, you know, tack on a variable there that if we want to have something that just keeps trying to move to another location, it just will. It'll get slower as it goes, potentially, but that's okay. But we could actually keep the uint there, so we might not. And so what I think we could do here is just say, all right, this situation here, we're not gonna actually do that the way that we were doing it there. So instead, you know, we're gonna do something like, we're gonna do something like, let's say this. And then what we're gonna do is say, if unique equals 0, we don't print anything. and if unique equals anything else, we're going to call. We're going to tack that on. You know what I mean? I think that should be fine. Well, you know what though? It's not that great, I guess, because the file name can't be there, but that's probably okay. We can probably just do it this way. You know what I mean? So we're probably okay there. Let me take a look. Yeah. So what we want to do here is say this temp game code DLL full path nonsense stuff, right? That thing is not gonna happen no more, right? So that's out of the mix. So this when we go to actually do this load, instead of having the temp DLL name come in there, it's going to come in here. And we're going to need to pass a state in here that would allow us to actually access the stuff we need. But otherwise, this bit of nonsense is going to let us pass a variable name. And then what we're going to do is inside here, we're going to keep trying to copy until we can't copy anymore. So we're going to do something like this. If you hot reload more than 10 and 24 times, you're gonna have to stop. You're gonna have to restart. So yeah, you go through the temp DLLs, you ask for each one in series. If this succeeds, you stop. If it fails, you ink the number. So you're just going to keep trying, like, to see if you can actually copy the darn file. And if you can, then you're good to go, right? So inside the state, wherever that saucy gentleman is, so inside here, right, we're going to have a thing called temp DLL number. And then when you do win32 build.exe path file name, blah, 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 right, you're going to be able to pass the unique there. And then we're going to have one that's like, if you don't want to do that, then we just pass 0. Right? Which will append nothing. So by default, it just works exactly the way that it used to, and nothing actually changes. But if you are trying to use it with that, why is this all messed up? Okay, there we go. Then it just works. We need to pass the win32 state here, so because that wasn't getting that before, but now it will have to. And so let me go down and just look here at how that's working. The global win32 state, yeah. So I assume the win32 state is actually cleared by default. In fact, we're not clearing through Mr. So yeah, it definitely is. So all we really need to do now is when we go to call that function, it needs to actually get past the state information. I assume that's just state. And then maybe that just works. Or maybe we delete our entire file, all of our files in our hard drive crashes. Who knows? Let's take a look. So what we would expect to see now is in the build directory, right? Here's the build directory and all the garbage that's in there. What you can see is there's a handmade temp.dll. And so now what I would expect to see is if I make a change now, right, like I'm doing the editor or whatever, like I said, and if I make a change now to one of these things, I would expect it to like update, and the handmade DLL will not get over, the handmade temp.dll will not get overwritten. It will actually just create another one, which has a different number appended to the end. It should be, or to the beginning, so it should be like 01 underscore, right? So yeah, that's all we're talking about here. So let's see if that actually works. So inside here, like if I want to still tone that down a little bit, which I may want to, right? Like maybe I change this to something like that. I should see that color change eventually here, hopefully. Yeah, it looks like it did. And then in here I should see. Yep. There it is. Okay. All right, so I think we've mostly accomplished everything we wanted. And I think we're good to go. Like, I think we can now just actually go focus on implementation stuff. I think that's as good as I might want to move the variably sized one here over to the end. And I also might want those editable type things. I might want those to sort of be together, right? Probably, maybe. So it's more like that. So I think that's really all I want to do for other stuff there. Like, yeah, so that. And then that's probably good enough. Like, you know, we don't need anything too fancy. So probably we're good to go here. And maybe that unused will just be add. Yeah, I don't know, something like that. The other thing is maybe in the editor, you know, this thing shouldn't be proportional to window size. Maybe it's just a fixed size because it kind of is just a fixed size sort of a thing. So, you know, maybe this is like UI space min x plus however many pixels this thing is, right? Like, because it's not scalable. It's just a fixed size, and it doesn't matter how big the window is. It has to be that size to fit the junk in there that's in there. You know what I mean? And so not sure how many pixels that should actually be. It should probably be another, looks like 200 maybe. But that may make more sense because then it's just taking up however much space it actually needs to fill itself up, and then, you know, then you're good to go. So you select one of these, and that's the correct size there, and then, you know, you do that, and it's fine, right? So that seems good. All right. This should really be a little bit longer though. I'm going to go ahead and call that for now. And we will go to Q&A. Recently said that Qt is not that good. What do you dislike about it? Pretty much everything. I mean, I don't even know where to start. If you compare the sort of the notion of what you would want to understand. In other words, I want to make a user interface, right? And you know, you've never used Qt before, so you're coming to it, and you know, the first thing that you obviously want to think about in terms of any API design is literally everything the person has to learn to use the API is wasted time, right? Because the goal of using Qt or any other UI library for that matter is not to learn Qt. Qt is worthless as a thing in of itself. It's just the UI that it produces that you wanted. So any information you had to ingest or anything that you had to learn to use that thing is cognitive overhead that you could have been spending somewhere else. So someone comes to a system and they're like, I want to use this UI library. Just from the outset, the goal is they know what the user interface they're trying to make looks like. Like they're like, all right, I want, you know, a list box here, and I want to put some stuff in that list box, and the user's going to click on it, and whichever one they click on, they're going to make a box over here that shows, you know, a different UI based on which one they clicked on, and that they know. You know, they don't have to learn that. They know what they wanted it to be. And so then what you want to look at is what is the process through which a person learns how to represent those ideas that they have in their head in Qt. And that is a nightmare. I mean, let me just give you a brief example of what that looks like. It's been a while since I've looked at Qt, so you'll have to forgive me. It takes me a while to get, you know, through the various pieces there, right? But it's like, all right, so here's some stuff, you know, that's like, I don't know, let's talk about a calendar widget. So I want to make a calendar widget. Here's the documentation for the calendar widget. As you saw, I just clicked on it here, right? And it's like, all right, where is all of this stuff and what does it mean? Like, how do I place the calendar widget somewhere? Like, I just want to make one of these. How do I put it somewhere or put it into a layout or something like that, right? And what you very quickly kind of end up seeing is that, well, in order to understand how a calendar widget goes about being placed somewhere, you have to look at like all of the things that a calendar widget like inherits from, right? And so you got to start like, you end up climbing, right? So you're like, oh, okay. So a calendar widget doesn't have anything to do with like where the thing goes. It's like a queue widget that says where the thing goes, maybe, right? Okay, so what are the things that says how do I place a queue widget somewhere, right? Like, okay, I guess I have to do move maybe. Well, there's something. So that's got a int x and y in there, right? That seems like a way I could do it. So I guess I call move maybe on my calendar widget. Maybe. I mean, I don't know. Let's see. Move. Okay, it doesn't have any documentation for what it does. So I don't know. It's a setter function for the property pause. Okay. Does pause say where the widget is? Okay, it's the position of the widget within its parent widget. So now I have to go, well, okay, so what's the parent widget? Like, the parent widget I didn't set. So I guess if I create one of these Q widgets, I probably have to put it inside a parent widget. So maybe I just call set parent widget, or maybe not. Like, I don't know, right? I'm not sure. Those sorts of things are not that hard to figure out, right? So like, I can stumble through those and be like, okay, I get it, right? Like, I know there's a hierarchy here somewhere and it all works out, right? Once you start getting into things that are more complicated than that, that's not just like things you might guess what they are, like position, this structure becomes impenetrable. Because then you're like, all right, I need to know what happens when like the person clicks on that data view. I need to make that like do a thing over here. So I need this guy to like respond to that thing that the other person's doing. And you are just crawling through these docs, just inundated with stuff that has nothing to do with anything, right? And you're just crossing your fingers that you can find out what the magic set of crazy, like parented things inside things that are routed to other things can possibly do, right? That's just learning how to use it. So that doesn't have anything to do with whether it's good or bad, even like as a library. That's your life from now on, is understanding a bunch of crap that has nothing to do with your user interface. It's just implementation details because these people decided that a calendar widget was a widget and a dock widget is a widget, and also other things are dock widgets, and you have to know which ones those were and all, right? And oh, and by the way, widgets are objects as well, so sometimes you got to end up in here looking at things, all that stuff, right? So you have to learn a complete mental ontology that has nothing to do with what you were trying to do. You just wanted to create a calendar widget, and you didn't care about any of that, right? That's not even starting to talk about the quality of Qt. That's just talking about the cognitive overhead that Qt forces you to learn, rather than you just being able to state what you were trying to do. If we go to like something that's like a tutorial, that's a meta language. Let me try to open up I just want to load some sample code so I can start talking about why I think it's bad in general, which is to say, assuming you're willing to accept the cognitive overhead of a giant class hierarchy that means nothing, it's like irrelevant. It's just how they chose to interface it, but it's all exposed, so you have to understand all of that. Let's say here, right? Okay. So, if you want to make a Qt thing, you're already in the thick of it because you're always inheriting from and using all kinds of C++ stuff. So, if you don't like C++, forget it, right? You can't use Qt. So you got to buy into C++ first and assume that you want to do that kind of stuff. So your stuff's always going to look like this. It's always going to have a lot of like inherited style stuff happening. And that's just, it is what it is. Okay, so when you actually start using Qt, you can see right here how the stuff starts to kind of work out, right? There ends up being all of this garbage where you have to constantly connect things to other things. Like, nothing in it is immediate mode. It's all like a giant retained graph behind the scenes where you have to wire all your crap up together And they even have like preprocessors you have to run sometimes to make this happen. I remember it was like really ugly, the project that I was on that was actually using this stuff. It was super heinous. So let's try to get to some actual code that actually does something here, right? So you can kind of see like what is going on here starts to get kind of squirrely. Like, all right, so here's what they're claiming is the implementation of save as. So I create a Q file dialog and I pass it myself, which presumably is because we're inherited from window, right? So then I say, well, I'm gonna make this thing modal. I'm going to like, I don't know what set accept mode does. I have no idea, I don't remember. I'm gonna set some of the things. Then I'm gonna call exec and I'm gonna wait for a return value, I guess. So what is happening in here? What's happening? I mean, if you're a game, you've got to be running frames and stuff. What is happening? Like, this is actually that's gonna stop. That's gonna go into their code, and you're gonna be sitting here in the middle of a save as loop. What are you gonna do, right? So now, are you gonna put this on a separate thread? Like, I don't know, right? You certainly can't drop through, so the dialog.exec call, is blocking call, basically. I don't even know what to make of that, right? That's unusable already, and we haven't even gotten anywhere yet, right? Same here. I don't know what that's supposed to be. You've got these weird string wrapper things going on here. This is, again, a blocking modal call. Your app can't be doing anything while that's happening, or you have to create a thread, right, to have that happen. Then, I mean, like, just look at this. Look at all this stuff, right? All of this kind of stuff that's going on, tons and tons of typing that's unnecessary, right? Like, what's all this, like, I don't even know. All this code is just to create stuff. All of that is code that actually is now retained. So every time you change the state of your program, you've got to go through, and all this stuff has to be stored too, right? Like, you have to remember what these things were if you ever wanted to change them, right? I've got to be able to get to all this stuff. So it's not like I just have like in our code where we just go like, what are the things that we want to do this frame? Let's do them. Here you've got to retain, everything you've got to retain. If you're okay with retain mode, then all right. So, looking at this thing, it's like, all right, I've got to create an icon. And maybe that's fine because, maybe, what else are you going to do, right? You got to make an icon somewhere here. I'm not sure what the from theme stuff does, but it probably lets you like remap it or something, right? So that's probably fine. So you're creating an action here, and the action, it looks like, has, the string kind of bound with it. And the action is bound on a window. So like whoever I am, that's going to presumably feed back through me, I guess, right? So now you've got like this sort of key sequence stuff. Presumably you wouldn't have to do that. Maybe you do have to do that, in which case that's kind of bad, but that's all right. I'll load from there. And then I'm going to like attach, the tooltip to it that I want to display or whatever. I've got this connection again that I have to do in order to get this thing to come back through me. I have no idea. That's just wasted work. There's no reason for that because you already have one of them. Like you already had to create an action. So why you can't just test to see if the action gets called, I have no idea. So I don't even know what the point is of that. I guess that's to say, instead of me having an if statement, I just want you to call this if this happens, right? And then finally, you're going to add them in. So what's wrong with that? Like maybe you like retain mode, you're like, that looks great. It's horrible. Why? Because every single last thing in here is now non-responsive. Nothing here can be dynamic, right? If you wanted this tooltip to say open existing file only in the case where you could open existing file, and you wanted to say something else like file is not available or something when that wasn't true, now, again, this is stored state you have to keep in your program somewhere to reach in and set the tooltips all the time, and you have to set them correctly every time. rather than just you having a code path that knows which one to do and it pops up, like this is why immediate mode is like always my preference for how you write the user level code for this, is that way you just have all the knowledge already inherent in the path that goes through the code. You don't have to have two separate paths, one that creates the standing structure and one that updates it. Same thing here. Maybe I want it to call open window in some cases and I want to call something else in other cases. In that case, this is just dead letter, right? All this is doing is wasting my time because now I just have to bind it to a function that is the function that would then see which function I'm going to call, right? So again, it's just all of this, almost the entire thing, when you start and you're like a basic UI programmer, you think this maybe looks good because you don't think of all the complexity you're eventually going to have in your shipping app, right? But once you do, all of these things end up being irrelevant. You have to fix them all later. And every last little one of these things is going to be an update synchronization problem that you're going to have later. And that's why when you use an app like a Qt app or a C# app, because they follow these models, that's why we get all those weird things where, like, remember the other day we were just using it and like one of the menus from the debugger was still popped up even after I switched which application I was using? Stuff like that you get all the time because they're all based on these standing data structures that you just hope you wrote the code to like update them properly for the current state of your app, but you never do because no one can. It's too hard, right? There's too many possible state changes that go in there. So let's see if they ever get to anything more complicated here, because this is all really vanilla basic stuff, which any UI library you can do. Like, it's not going to be a good test of whether this thing works well. So let's see if we have anything maybe where they've got like a like actual interrelated user interface stuff that's got to happen. Let me just see what we've got here. Yeah, so like maybe, well, let's see how bad drag and drop is. I don't know, it's probably not that bad. How bad could it possibly be? That looks okay. I wouldn't complain about that. So let's see here. Trying to get down to where they actually have this looks like mostly discussions of the code here. This is sort of more what I wanted to get to. I have to page in back all my Qt knowledge, which is taking a little while. This is just a ton of code, so maybe this is a bad thing to look at. It may be hard for me to like give good examples of how it's problematic without actually going through a complex example that I've already looked at, because this is a massive amount of code if you look at all the stuff that's in here, so I can't really assemble it all in my head fast enough to give a good example, because I've never seen this example before, right? Let's see here. Qt. here's a list of examples. There we go. Okay, so let's see if we can find something a little bit more complicated here. Let's say we want to animate something. Seems reasonable, right? Let's see what animated tiles is. All right. So here's our animated tiles code. Let's see what it's actually doing. So yeah, you know, we create an application and it looks like it's making a bit of graphics there, which is fine. Yeah, so it looks like, I mean, I don't really want to rag on this too much because I don't know how high quality this sample code's supposed to be. But I mean, seriously, like you're passing strings to say what the values are that you want to have animated for this thing are. I mean, I guess that's fine. If you really don't care, I mean, I suppose it's okay. So anyway, it's, you know, they're going through here and they're creating like what amounts to what's items count here in this case. There's 64 of these things, I guess. So they're creating 64 items and they're creating points for each of those. Is that right? Yeah. And I mean, just look at this stuff. This is the animation example. I mean, this is how they're saying you would animate stuff. You know how we animate stuff, right? It's very easy. You just have a little piece of code that just says what the path should be. You don't really have to do anything else. I mean, it's nuts, right? It's all retain mode, and these things are just horrible to work with. I don't know. I mean, maybe people like doing things this way, but it's so unresponsive. I mean, all of this stuff gets created ahead of time. It can't possibly react to the user because in order to react to the user, you'd have to recreate this entire thing. So all it can do is just like trigger something that's going to make a big, gigantic animation, right? And that animation cannot ever respond to the user because it's been pre-described. Not to mention this fact that look at how much of a pain in the butt this is to describe. I mean, we're talking about a thing that makes that, right? I mean, it's one little for I loop with a sine and a cosine in it. And they had to do all of this stuff. Create tons of standing structures. They had to use the position by making a name out of the position. They had to go through and set all these ease curves and durations on everything. They had to add these animations to a group of animations. They had to create transitions between them. They had to bind those to the buttons. I mean, and all of it's non-responsive. So if we had done this code, right, this code would have just been called straight path. So when you actually went into it, you could change every time it was called anything that you wanted about it, right? Here, imagine what's going to happen if all I want to do is have a slider, and this is probably the most concise way I can say why Qt sucks. This is true about everything in it. Let's say I just want a slider that says how big the circle was, right? Or, you know, how many things around the circle there were. I would have to delete all of these and recreate them again every time you move the slider, right? So it's like all of this state, including stuff that it's totally not stateful. Like, this is not state. You never want this to be state. Everything is state. Everything's an object, and it's all going to do. What if the animation doesn't fit in memory? What if I wanted an infinite number of those things? Like, I wanted it perfectly smooth. I don't know. Like, it's nuts. And everything's like that. So you're always creating these huge standing structures. They are so unresponsive. So you end up with really brittle UIs that they can't react to what the user's doing, you know? I don't know. It's not good. I would like to provide a more complete answer because I could really nitpick almost every last decision in Qt, but that would require me to page it all back in again, right? Like, but it's all bad. Like every last little decision in here is bad, pretty much. There's no good ones in here. And, you know, it just all flows from the fact that there's a massive cognitive overhead because there's billions of objects, most of which don't do anything. They're just like meaningless sort of API glue. And you always have to create them and string them together to get anything done, which forces you to keep this massive backlog of Qt crap in sync with your own stuff. And it's just a huge nightmare. So rather than just something in an IMGUI style where you just go, oh, what do I need? All right, just draw this right now. You're building all of these huge structures all the time. And it's just really, really onerous and slow for coding. And error prone is the other thing, you know? So that's my feeling on it. Again, I wish I could give you a more concise answer. It's been a long time since I used it. And so getting down to more specific, concrete, like let me show you each thing they should have done and why, to disentangle it all would be a pretty big undertaking. But trust me, you can do it. Just made a new version for dump view. Feel free to come back to this after the Q&A is ended. Oh, cool. Pith note. Regarding the Qt slider example, so if I get this correctly, in an IMGUI, one just goes through the UI elements and just draws them depending on whatever the slider value says. Yeah, exactly. So the point with IMGUI and RMGUI is an interface point. It has nothing to do with whether you store stuff or not. So an IMGUI can still behind the scenes store as much garbage as Qt if it wanted to, right? And you could do that. The point is really whether or not things are represented in code or data. And generally speaking, in a UI library, you want almost nothing represented in data on the user side, because if the user wants to represent things as data, they just can. Right? They don't need you to do it. So for example, in a Qt library, I'm just going to, in fact, you know what? I should have started with this. In a Qt library, let's say I've got a list view and there's stuff in the list view, right? Yeah, here, right? So I've got a list view and there's things in the list view, right? So the list view has items in it. And I need to be able to add items. How do I add items here? This is the classic Qt thing. I just want to add an item to the list view. Where is it? Of course, it's not here. Why would it be on the list view? It's probably like you create an item and parent it to the list view or something, right? Yeah, of course, there's no add function. Here you go. All right, so here is an example of what you have to do with a list view, right? In order to I just want to add stuff to the listing view. Like that's all I want to do. This is not the C code though. I really want the C code for it. Here. So take a look at this, right? What happens in a program when you want to make a list view? I guarantee you All of those things are represented in your program somewhere already, right? So I've got all the elements in my game. I want to put a list view that lists them, right? So I already have all of the elements. Now what I have to do, if I want to list them in one of Qt's listers, is I have to create an actual entry for every single element in my game inside their list thing. So now I've got two lists of entities, the one in Qt and mine. And because that's a heavyweight operation, because it's actually recreating a giant, 10,000 entry list thing in Qt, I can't do it every frame. I've got to do it conservatively. So now every time I create an entity in my game, I've got to add to the Qt list. And every time I delete an entity in my game, I got to delete the right member of the Qt list. That means my entities now have to either store pointers to the Qt lists, or I have to store a map that has a mapping between the two. I mean, it's just unusably bad, right? This is just horrible design. You don't ever want these things. They force you to do all of this work for no reason. All you want to do for a list view is say, hey, look, one of two things. Either every frame, I'm just going to call you and say, here are each of the list entries, if I don't want to think about it, right? Or I just want to make one call at the beginning that says, tell me the range of things you need, right? And then I'll tell you just those. If it's too many if there's a billion of them, right? So we're just going to use a subset. That's it, right? I don't want to maintain Qt widget lists. That's ridiculous, right? Like, it's just not good. And so pretty much universally, when you look at something, you go, someone might think Qt is good because they look and they say, oh, look, I can just add things to a list view, and then they show up. They don't realize how much of a pain in the butt it's going to be once they're in an actual application that has all of its own state and is trying to expose that state through the user interface. It just completely falls apart. And you end up doing like tons and tons of work to micromanage the UI to get to do anything reasonable. It's just bad. So yeah, I can't stand that stuff. Regarding keeping audio and video synced, when you did the audio system, you were very strict about playing without losing one frame. That was before you moved to OpenGL. Now there's latency between when we're issuing a frame until it's actually rendered. How are we going to keep them in sync? I guess for Hammy here, it's not a huge deal, but I'm curious your opinion about how to keep them in sync. So actually, you can't really keep them in sync on PC, as far as I know. That was true even before we switched to OpenGL. So the thing you have to remember is when we were using Windows before, when we were just using it to display our bitmaps, it still goes through a compositor, which still delays your presentation. So we weren't getting an immediate display necessarily. We were just trying to limit the number of. We were basically trying not to add any additional frames of latency to the ones that were already there. So that hasn't changed. It's basically the same. If you want to try and get sync to be perfect, I don't think Windows really ever added any way for you to do it. I just don't think it's possible. I could be wrong about that, but I think it's not. My recollection is that on macOS, it is possible. So, for example, on macOS, I believe you can ask for two timers. One is like where we are, when I submit this audio, where will it be played? And the other is when will the next frame be flipped to be viewed on the monitor? And you can actually try to line those up properly. I hope that helps. Pithna, thanks for the list view example. That made it pretty clear. Where do you think it comes from that people build those verbose APIs that don't give you much flexibility? It's because what they do is they've just made the UI system, and then they just make you program the actual stuff, right? So if you think about what someone sits down to make a UI library, what they do is they go, oh, okay, so I need a list view. So obviously I need to remember what each thing in the list view is. So that's what I made. And then I'm like, what's the API to that? Okay, the API to that is, here, user, you tell me anytime you want to make one of those things in list view, right? So that's the mentality, is like, let me just completely expose whatever I wrote internally as the API, and now you've got to do it. Qt happens to be egregiously bad because the programmers were heavy C++ object-oriented style programmers. You also get all that class hierarchy stuff. That was how they chose to do it internally as well, right? So you get all that shoveled on you as well. But even people who don't do that stuff, they still have that problem because they don't think about what should the API actually look like to this thing, right? Like, what would the user actually want to say? They probably don't want to have to micromanage all of my state. They probably need some better tools for just articulating to me what the parts of the state are that they care about at this particular time. And I should be responsible for doing the rest of the work necessary to make all this stuff work out, right? And so that's really the design mentality problem. And so most UI libraries have this problem because they don't realize that an API to the UI library shouldn't just be about you having to micromanage everything the UI library does, which is what they usually are. If retain mode is so bad, why haven't immediate GUIs taken over the desktop mobile market yet? So I think they actually have. I'm pretty sure IM GUIs are actually now almost everything. And the reason for that is because at some point, and I don't know why, the web community got the IM GUI bug. And so now my understanding is like all that stuff, like React.js, like all that stuff is IM now, or at least partially IM. Qt is not a common application layer to use for most things. You know, the 99% of the things people use today are not Qt, right? And they're not retain mode either. So basically, like, all of these things, these like JavaScript stuff, like that's all immediate mode. They went that way. So the answer is they have. Nobody who ever uses an IM GUI will ever go back to using an RM GUI, right? It's like, it's horrible to go the other direction. So once communities understand how to do those interfaces, they will. That's just a given. Does that help? And it has nothing to do with whether you're a game or anything else. Every UI should be responsive. You know, it should respond to changing conditions as fast as possible. So you have an array of some struct type, and each item has a name, which is what you want to represent as an item in the list for the end user to choose from. Would it be a good idea to hand the UI some pointer to the first name and specify some stride to the next, or how would you do it? It doesn't really matter usually because UIs don't normally display enough things at once to care about the push through. So typically all you really need is some way of windowing what needs to get articulated on a particular frame. And then you can usually just make a call per, and it's fine. This is why websites are slow. They are trying to impose the IMGUI paradigm to retain style and suffer with performance. Let they compare data graphs and find differences and imply changes to retain model. Yeah, it's definitely the case that if the web had just been immediate mode to begin with, you would have had a lot better performance. I don't actually think that's why websites are slow, though. Websites are slow for a lot of other reasons, and you know, data graph comparisons are probably not, they don't help, but they're probably not the main reason. If you fixed that, you probably would still be pretty slow because there's a lot of bad stuff going on there, right? And by the way, 0LPBM, I'm not giving these as good examples. I'm just saying you were asking why people didn't change to it. They did. Everyone did. Nobody thinks RMGUI is good anymore as far as I know. That day's over. The question is just how the IM GUI stuff should work, and which ones are good, because you can still make a very bad IM GUI, right? It's not hard to make a bad API, even if the paradigm you pick is better. It's still bad, right? Does that make sense? So I was in no way trying to suggest that React.js is good. I've never used it. So. What do you think of annotation-based programming? I don't think I know what that is. I don't know what I'm looking at here. All you have to deal with is a single Java RSS session. I guess what I would say is I don't know what this is, so I can't give an opinion about it. It doesn't... I'd have to look at it more carefully, but it doesn't look like actually a thing. It just looks like regular programming. It just looks like programming. I mean, just because you chose to call something an annotation doesn't change the fact that it's still just programming. It looks like you added some stuff to your programming language that just is now changing the programming language. Isn't it? Is there something else? All right, anyway, I'm going to wrap it up. Sorry, I wish I could give a better answer for the annotation-based programming. I don't really know what that is. So, Dr. Jester, profiling huge websites is pretty common to see 100 to 500 milliseconds spent on things like relayouting or recalculating CSS or just purely inside the JavaScript. I've made a purely Dear IM GUI WebGL WebAssembly website. It takes 0.5 milliseconds per frame to compute the layout. That's cool. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't know. I mean, it's totally possible that some websites are that way. Like I said, it's just there's a lot of slow stuff on the web. So, you know, I'm sure some of it is that fact, but I think depending on the website, you're going to have more or less of that. Is all I can say, right? Like some websites are going to have a lot of that, some websites aren't. Some of it, you know, may have nothing to do with the act of doing that comparison and just the fact that JavaScript itself is not very well optimized for certain things, and just the act of running the code is bad, you know, because the code's written poorly and that sort of stuff. So it's really hard to say. I have no idea, but I don't doubt it, right? Like, in other words, I'm not saying that it's probably not a problem. I'm just saying that it's probably one of many problems. You know what I mean? Like, some websites you fix that and maybe that fixes the whole thing. Other websites it's probably like, ugh, like you could fix that and then you still have 10 other things you got to fix, you know? I like the idea of that WebGL thing though. All right, I'm gonna wrap it up. Like, it's fun to an IM GUI WebGL that's just cool. Like, I like that idea. Please make games for Linux. People need to buy some games for Linux. It's really up to people to make that happen, because there's tons of people shipping games on Linux. Like, a lot of people tried and it just doesn't catch on. You know what I mean? It's a social problem, not a development problem, because people tried, like a lot of people ship games and you can get a lot of games on Linux. It's not a big market. It's not even worth the amount of time it takes you to port usually. And so it's just, there isn't enough of a market there. And the problem is probably that, like, you know, when you're talking about a market where you need to get 100,000 people together to buy something, there just aren't that many people buying games on Linux to create those numbers for one individual game, you know? That seems to be the main problem. And I don't know how you fix it, but if you could fix it, that would be pretty awesome. Because having Linux be, I was hoping a lot when the Steam machines came, when SteamOS was going to be a thing. I was hoping that was going to convince people to do it. It didn't really end up being a thing. But, you know, like I said, tons of games are on Linux now. It has not created a market. So it's not a lack of games at the moment. It's that people aren't buying them. And, you know, it's not that no one's buying them. Some people are, but just not enough to create a market. That's really the only problem. And so that's why people just don't consider it a priority. So in general, what ends up happening is people usually just like go to SDL and ship that and don't really support it. And I think that's mostly what you're going to end up seeing on Linux, right? It's just not a primary platform, and it's not going to be till someone makes that happen socially. It's entirely social. All you would have to do is get those numbers up. The first time someone sells 100,000 copies of an indie game on Linux, everyone will make Linux a main platform. Like, all you need is an example that the market is there. Right? And I don't know how you make that happen, but if you can make that happen, you just that will be heard, right? Like, you know, it's just a social problem. It's just a social problem, convincing people to use it. It's obviously not a money problem because Linux is free. It is sometimes a compatibility problem because Linux doesn't always work so well on people's computers. Laptops are a big problem on Linux. Desktops usually are better, right? So there are some issues there too, but, you know, mostly it's a social problem. Can you convince people? Can you convince gamers to actually run Linux? And, you know, I don't know how you do that, but if you can do that, you'll be a big hero if you can do that, right? All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining me for the episode of Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you as always. If you want to follow along with the series at home, you can always pre-order the game on handmadehero.org. It comes with the source code, so you can play around with it. We're doing surprise streams all this month and next month in honor of Kronfislov. And so I'll see you back here probably real soon. We'll see. Until then, have fun programming, and I'll see everyone on the internet. Take it easy, everybody.